8 Deadliest Wars of the 21st Century, Part 1. Second Congo War, 1998 to 2003. Far and away the deadliest war of the 21st century was a conflict that had its genesis in the 20th. The Rwandan genocide, the toppling and death of Zairian President Mobutu Sese Seko, and ethnic strife between Hutu and Tutsi peoples were direct contributing factors to the Second Congo War, also called the Great War in Africa or Africa's First World War because of its scope and destructiveness. In May 1997, rebel leader Laurent Kabila deposed Mobutu and renamed Zaire the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, but he soon found himself engaged in a civil war with some of the forces that had elevated him to power. The eastern third of the DRC became a battlefield every bit as bloody and contested as the Western Front in World War I had been. The armies of 9 countries and an assortment of affiliated militias devastated the countryside. Angola, Namibia, Chad, Sudan, and Zimbabwe backed Kabila's Congolese government forces, while troops from Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda supported anti-Kabila rebels. Mass rapes were reported in areas of conflict, and large sections of the DRC were stripped of resources, as organized combat between professional armies gave way to brigandage and plunder. An estimated 3 million people, mostly civilians, were killed in the fighting or died of disease or malnutrition as a result of the conflict. Syrian Civil War. As the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East and North Africa, popular uprisings toppled the authoritarian regimes in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen. In Syria, however, President Bashar al-Assad responded to protests with a combination of political concessions and escalating violence against his own people. The uprising became a civil war that spread violence into neighboring Iraq and provided a fertile breeding ground for militant groups such as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also known as ISIS. Rebel groups seized huge swathes of territory, and the area under government control was reduced to a small strip of land in western Syria. Assad resorted to increasingly desperate and savage measures to maintain power, dropping crude barrel bombs on urban populations and using chemical weapons on rebel-controlled territory. As regional powers and Western countries assumed a greater role in the conflict, it seemed inevitable that Assad would be forced from power. Kurdish militias advanced from the Kurdish Autonomous Region in northern Iraq, and the U.S. conducted air strikes against ISIL forces in both Syria and Iraq. Darfur conflict. In early 2003, rebel groups took up arms against the Khartoum-based regime of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, igniting long-standing tensions in the Darfur region of western Sudan. That conflict erupted into what the U.S. government later described as the first genocide of the 21st century. After rebel groups scored a string of high-profile victories against the Sudanese military, the Sudanese government equipped and supported Arab militias that came to be known as Janjaweed. The Janjaweed conducted a targeted campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing against the civilian population of Darfur, killing at least 300,000 people and displacing nearly 3 million. It was not until 2008 that a joint United Nations and African Union peacekeeping force was able to restore a semblance of order to the region. On March 4, 2009, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Bashir, the first time that the ICC sought the arrest of a sitting head of state, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. That investigation was suspended in December 2014 because of a lack of cooperation from the UN Security Council. Iraq War. Neoconservative officials within the administration of U.S. President George W. Bush had sought to topple the regime of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein prior to the events of September 11, 2001, but the deadliest terrorist attack in U.S. history would provide, at least in part, the casus belli for the Iraq War. Citing links between the Iraqi regime and al-Qaeda as well as the presence in Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, both claims that were ultimately proved false, the U.S. assembled a coalition of the willing and launched an attack on Iraq on March 20, 2003. The subsequent war unfolded in 2 distinct phases, a short one-sided conventional war, in which coalition forces suffered fewer than 200 fatalities in just over a month of major combat operations, and an insurgency that continued for years and claimed tens of thousands of lives. By the time U.S. combat forces were withdrawn in August 2010, more than 4,700 coalition troops had been killed, at least 85,000 Iraqi civilians had also been killed, but some estimates place that total much higher. The sectarian violence that racked the country in the wake of the overthrow of Hussein's Ba'athist regime gave rise to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also called ISIS, a Sunni group that sought to establish a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Between 2013 and the end of 2016, more than 50,000 additional civilians were murdered by ISIL or killed in clashes between ISIL and Iraqi government forces. Part 2 coming soon.